I just had a really good question from one of the members of Concussion Fix. I wanted to answer it for everyone. So here's a little video that I made about it. Oftentimes when we're following the diet, people with persistent concussion symptoms have trouble doing all the different things that sometimes the diet requires. For example, meal preparation, cooking, shopping really is a little bit more involved than if you're relying on more processed and store-bought foods. Now, obviously, if it's easier for a person to follow this long-term, this would be ideal. But if you're struggling after a couple weeks and realize a lot of your bandwidth and your planning and pacing is going into food preparation, first of all, I would say try to stick with it for a little longer, because usually after 3 or 4 weeks, that's when some of the habits and some of the shortcuts that initially were really hard for you to do really kick in. And so try to see if you can push to that 3 to 4 week mark to see if you can maybe just make it a little easier. And it does get easier over time. But if you're really struggling and you've been following it, but it's really been taking too much, here are a couple ways you can scale back and maybe simplify some of the things on the Concussion Fix diet. So number one, I would say the 3 most important things probably to continue to avoid would be number 1, sugar, number 2, alcohol, and number 3 would be gluten. Those would be the 3 things. All the other things in terms of avoidances, like super highly processed foods, making sure there's no seed oils, like for example, canola oil. I would say these are secondary things. Of course, we'd like to do that ideally, but avoiding those things requires a different level of commitment, especially when eating out, than those 3 things I just mentioned. So it should open the doors for you to be able to go to restaurants or ordering in if you ask for it to be sugar-free, making sure obviously there's no alcohol in it. That one's easy, but being gluten-free. Most restaurants give you great options. You could always order, a piece of chicken and vegetables with it, and then maybe a side of something like rice or quinoa or millet or buckwheat. These are all gluten-free options. So those are the 3 things I would maybe not compromise on until you really have made substantial strides in your concussion recovery. And then certain things like food services, shopping services, home delivery services could be great options for you if you're, again, struggling with some of that preparation. So that might be the second thing I would consider. And then really hydration, something that you really want to maintain throughout the whole program. So I would not really compromise on those things. So start with following it as much as possible, and then maybe you can add back in some of the things you're doing before, and then observe how you feel when you're adding some of these foods back in. Like a lot of people ask me about, should I be avoiding dairy products? Well, ideally for some people it's inflammatory, so they should be avoiding it. However, it's one of those things that are probably the first thing you can add back in. And so we do not want the program to be stressful for you. We don't want the dietary component to be stressful for you. But it's normal for you to be a little bit out of sorts and for a little bit challenged when you start something new. So just because it's a little uncomfortable, after a couple weeks, it does get easier somewhere in the 4 to 6 week mark. And then eventually patients tell me that they just end up enjoying eating that way because they just feel better and they've gotten the hang of things. Okay? Hopefully that was helpful for you simplifying the Concussion Fix diet.